What started as a quiet courtroom loss turned into a public reckoning. Karoline Leavitt took on a powerful judge and made the entire system take a hard look in the mirror. It started with a single sentence that sent ripples across New Hampshire's conservative base. Case dismissed. Lack of standing. Karoline Leavitt stood frozen in the back of the Concord courtroom, her jaw clenched, her hands still holding the printed summary of voter complaints. She had spent weeks helping gather affidavits from local poll watchers and election officials who noticed strange inconsistencies during the last cycle. She believed in the system. She believed there was a legal path to ensure fairness. But the judge, Douglas Keener, a man with 30 years behind the bench and a reputation for being hard to read, had other ideas. He barely looked up from his bench when he gave his ruling. No trial, no witnesses, just a cold dismissal. Beside Karoline sat Russ Barkley, a former Marine and county registrar. "That's it?" he muttered. "Just like that?" Karoline didn't answer. Her mind was racing too fast for words. They stepped outside into the parking lot where a few local reporters hovered, scribbling notes without real interest. The big networks hadn't bothered to show up. One reporter, a young woman from a local AM radio station, approached Karoline with her mic. "Miss Leavitt, any comment on the judge's ruling?" Karoline looked straight at the mic. "He didn't dismiss the case because the facts weren't strong. He dismissed it because he didn't want to hear them. We're not done." It wasn't bluster. It was a promise. Later that night, sitting in her kitchen in Rye, Karoline replayed the judge's words on her phone over and over. Lack of standing. It didn't sit right, not just because it meant the case was over, but because it felt preloaded, like the decision had been made long before they walked into that courtroom. Her dad, George, leaned against the counter behind her, arms crossed. "You're not going to let this slide, are you?" "No," Karoline said, staring at her screen. "There's something off about him, about all of this." George knew that tone in her voice. She'd used it before when she was 17 and took on the school board for canceling a veterans assembly. She had the same fire now, only sharper. But this wasn't high school. This was the justice system. The next morning, Karoline showed up at the campaign office with a stack of papers and tired eyes. She tossed the file onto the table. "I want every decision Judge Keener's made in the last 5 years." Taylor, her staffer, blinked. "All of them?" "Yes, and I want to know who his clerks are, who he's had dinner with, who's donated to his retirement fund, everything." It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about answers. But answers in politics are never clean. And what she found over the next week made her stomach turn. Judge Keener had once worked at a firm that quietly lobbied for out-of-state political groups. His adult son was on the board of a voter outreach nonprofit, one that had recently received a donation from a PAC with ties to a sitting Democratic senator. There were photos, event programs, a trail of dinners and endorsements that had flown under the radar. But none of it had ever been reported. Karoline sat down with Russ again, this time at a diner in Bedford. She pulled a manila folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "Everything Judge Keener doesn't want people to know." Russ flipped through the pages. "You planning to go to the press?" Karoline sipped her coffee. "No, not yet. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it right." But while Karoline began connecting the dots, something else started to bother her, and it had nothing to do with paperwork. Karoline wasn't sleeping much. Between public appearances and deep dives into Judge Keener's background, she found herself waking up in the middle of the night, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a pattern, one she couldn't yet prove, but she could feel in her bones. She started calling people, quietly. Former clerks, retired court staff, lawyers who had stood before Keener in previous cases. Most didn't want to talk. A few did, but only off the record. One of them was Harold Kessler, a defense attorney in Manchester who hadn't practiced in over a decade. They met at a rundown pizza place off I-93, the kind of joint with faded booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked since 2005. "You really want to go after Keener?" he asked her, his voice low, eyes scanning the room. "I want to know if he's been fair," she replied. Harold leaned back, took a long sip of his soda, then said, "He's careful, never leaves fingerprints, but he's political, has been since the late 90s. You're not imagining it." Caroline leaned in. Can you give me names? Anything concrete? No, he said. But I'll tell you this, he keeps his distance for a reason. His hands might be clean, but his friends aren't. That same night back at the office, she called Taylor and another aide, Jenna, and laid out what she had. The binders, the donor maps, the events, the court decisions that all leaned a certain way. It's not enough for an expose, Jenna said, cautiously flipping through the notes. But it's enough for a storm. Carolyn nodded. We're not publishing anything. We're going to force his hand. How? She smiled. Pressure. The next morning, Carolyn recorded a short, controlled video for social media. Just her, speaking directly to camera. There's a judge in New Hampshire who believes people like you don't have the right to question your elections. He dismissed a case without hearing the evidence. He said it didn't matter. But we found something, patterns, connections, bias, and now we're going to shine a light on all of it. She didn't name him, not yet, but the message landed. Within hours, her inbox filled with messages. Supporters, skeptics, journalists. Some wanted to help. Others demanded proof, but she was ready for both. And then something strange happened. A woman named Dana reached out through a secure email. No last name, no introduction. Just, I used to work in the state courthouse. I saw things. I'll talk. They met in a church parking lot just outside Laconia late on a Thursday afternoon. Dana was in her 50s, wiry, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that made Caroline lower her voice. He met with lobbyists, Dana said. Not in chambers, outside. Quiet places, coffee shops in Portsmouth, always with the same guy, Tommy Velt. Caroline scribbled in her notebook. The donor? Dana nodded. And one other person, a woman, blonde, works for a firm in Boston. Can you prove any of this? Dana hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and handed Caroline a folded receipt. He never knew I saw it, but I was there. This was the night before a major ruling, the one that gutted the election audit bill. Carolyn unfolded the receipt. It was dated 2 days before Keener's decision in a separate high-profile case, one that blocked deeper inspection of ballots statewide. Why are you giving this to me now? Caroline asked. Because someone needs to care, Dana said, tears in her voice. I thought it would get better. It didn't. But Caroline knew this wasn't just about exposing shady dinners. It was about forcing the country to pay attention to what had been ignored for far too long. Dana's tip changed everything. Caroline left that church parking lot with a folded receipt and a fire in her chest. The meeting hadn't given her everything, but it gave her what she needed most, a thread to pull. She started with Tommy Velt. His name had shown up once before, tucked inside a list of donors from a super PAC registered in Maine. But Dana's mention brought it to the front. Velt wasn't just any donor, he was a connector, a man who arranged private dinners between judges, attorneys, and certain operatives who kept their hands clean, but always seemed to walk away with favorable rulings. Caroline's first call was to Anthony Becker, a former state senator who'd been run out of politics for blowing the whistle on campaign finance violations. He lived in a small town near Nashua now, mostly stayed off the grid. I know who Tommy is, Anthony said, but you won't find him in headlines. He works in shadows. He throws big checks at low-profile names and expects loyalty. Quiet loyalty. Caroline pressed further. Would Keener have known what he was walking into by meeting with him? Of course, Anthony said. You don't have lunch with Tommy by accident. If Keener met him, it's because they were both in on something. It still wasn't proof, not yet. But it was a pattern that wouldn't go away. She kept digging. Her office walls slowly turned into a web of timelines, events, connections, and faces. Lines of red yarn tied names together across corkboards. It looked paranoid to anyone walking in, but it made perfect sense to her team. Then came a stroke of luck. Jenna, the aide who'd helped organize the donor data, found a PDF buried in an old campaign finance archive. It was an RSVP list to a dinner held 3 years ago at the Blackbrook Inn in Keene, hosted by a think tank. Low-key, no press, listed attendees, Tommy Velt, a Boston-based election consultant named Madeline Rowan, and Judge Douglas Keener. Caroline stared at the file, heart pounding. He was there, she whispered. They were all there. They searched for photos from the event, but found none. No tweets, no tagged images. It had been scrubbed clean. But the document was enough. She contacted a local columnist, someone she trusted, Daniel Reed from the Nashua Report. He had been skeptical of her before but respected her persistence. "I don't do hit pieces," he warned her over the phone. "This isn't a hit," she replied. "It's a pattern, and I'll show you every page." They met the next day. Karoline brought 2 boxes of documents, receipts, statements, archived filings, names that connected where no one had been looking. Daniel spent 3 hours going through it all in silence. Then he looked up and said, "You've got smoke. If we can find fire, we've got something real." He agreed to run a story, but carefully. No accusations, just facts, laid out with dates and details. The article dropped that Sunday. Questions mount around judicial conduct in election integrity case. It didn't accuse Judge Keener outright, but it asked why a sitting judge would dine privately with political consultants shortly before ruling on issues directly tied to their agendas. The story took off like a spark in dry grass. Talk radio picked it up. Local anchors began inviting Karoline for interviews. Social media lit up. Some attacked her, others defended her. But nobody was ignoring her anymore. And that's when the courthouse itself began to react. An anonymous clerk leaked an internal email. Judge Keener had canceled court for the next 3 days. Karoline sat alone in her car after hearing the news, staring at the dashboard, her mind loud with possibility. She whispered, "He's hiding." But just as Karoline prepared to take the next step, something unexpected happened. Someone from Judge Keener's circle reached out. The message came through a burner email with no signature. Just a sentence. "I can't defend him anymore. You were right." Attached was a single photo. Karoline opened the file slowly, her breath catching as the image loaded. It was grainy, clearly snapped in secret, but unmistakable. Judge Keener seated at a private table in a quiet corner of a seafood restaurant in Portsmouth, across from Tommy Velt and Madeline Roan. A server approached with wine. All 3 looked relaxed, comfortable. The timestamp on the photo was just 6 days before Keener dismissed the election integrity case. This was no coincidence. Karoline forwarded it to Daniel Reed with a simple subject line. "Here's the fire." Within 24 hours, the Nashua Report published a follow-up. "Private dinner between judge and political donors raises questions of judicial bias." The photo was front and center. The reaction was instant. Local radio callers flooded the lines. TV anchors brought in legal analysts. People who had never paid attention to courtrooms were suddenly debating judicial ethics in line at the grocery store. Keener's team released a weak statement. He claimed the dinner was a chance encounter and that no case-related discussion occurred. But no one was buying it. Voters weren't stupid. They knew when they were being played. That same day, Karoline's office received over 500 emails. Some were from citizens sharing their own complaints about Keener. But a few were different. One came from a former legislative aide who had worked under a Democratic state rep. He helped get Keener reappointed 3 years ago, the email read. Said he was reliable. That word always stuck with me. Another came from a woman who had filed a civil complaint against a local official tied to campaign fraud. Her case had been thrown out by, of course, Keener. Karoline read each one, carefully. Some weren't usable, some were hearsay, but the broader picture was undeniable. There was a climate, a culture, one where certain people operated with quiet permission. And Keener, whether by design or convenience, had been part of it. That Friday, Karoline called a press conference. She stood in front of a courthouse, not the state one, but the old county courthouse in Goffstown. Symbolic, deliberate. Behind her were boxes of documents labeled with bold black marker. Timelines, connections, emails, donors, rulings. Reporters from across the state showed up. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She walked them through each piece. One ruling? Maybe that's coincidence, she said, holding up a folder. 2, you ask questions. But when it becomes a pattern, when you trace decisions to meetings, meetings to donations, and donations to direct benefits, then it's not coincidence. It's corruption with a polite face. She paused. Let the silence hang. I don't care who you vote for. This isn't about party. This is about trust. And when our courts lose that, everything else starts to fall. It wasn't just the words, it was the clarity behind them. She wasn't grandstanding, she was building a case piece by piece in public view. The press conference aired on every local station, and a clip of her speech made it onto national television the next morning. Conservative commentators hailed her persistence. Independent outlets praised her for refusing to make it personal. But Keener's camp didn't stay quiet for long. By Monday, his attorney had filed a cease and desist letter against Karoline, accusing her of defamation and demanding she retract her statements. The document dripped with threats, but no actual denials. Karoline's legal advisor read it and laughed. "Classic bluff," he said. "He's trying to scare you. But if this goes public, we might finally force an ethics probe." That same afternoon, Karoline stood in her office, windows open, the folder of evidence laid out on the desk. Taylor walked in, holding a printed email. "You're not going to believe this." It was from the Judicial Conduct Committee. They were opening a preliminary inquiry into Judge Keener's conduct. But as the story broke wide open, Karoline realized this wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about what came next and whether the system had the courage to fix itself. Keener didn't show up to court for the next 8 days. His docket was quietly reassigned. His chambers, once constantly staffed and busy, stayed dark behind closed blinds. No official explanation was given, but courthouse whispers traveled fast. Clerks spoke in hushed tones. Attorneys began requesting alternate judges, citing potential conflict of interest. It was clear the silence surrounding Keener wasn't out of respect. It was tension, the kind you could feel even through the marble walls. Meanwhile, Karoline was everywhere. Fox, Newsmax, and even a few skeptical centrist outlets brought her on for interviews. Her tone stayed the same, measured, direct. She repeated one line over and over again. "This isn't about a political win. This is about restoring basic faith." But the more she spoke, the louder the backlash grew. Anonymous accounts flooded her inbox with insults and threats. Someone leaked her private address online. Protesters showed up outside her home in Rye, holding signs accusing her of attacking democracy. Her dad didn't flinch. He stood at the end of the driveway, arms folded, daring anyone to take a single step onto their lawn. "Let them hold signs," he muttered. "They're mad because they're scared." Karoline didn't back down. She doubled security, she stayed off Twitter, and she kept pushing forward. 2 weeks after the press conference, the Judicial Conduct Committee made their first public statement. They confirmed they were reviewing whether Judge Keener had violated ethical standards through undisclosed associations with political donors and consultants prior to issuing key rulings. That word, undisclosed, made headlines. It didn't take long for politicians to start distancing themselves. A state representative who once praised Keener now dodged questions in interviews. A few local leaders who had once accepted checks from Tommy Velt suddenly returned the funds and issued statements claiming they had no knowledge of any impropriety. Karoline watched the slow unraveling with quiet resolve. She wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because for every win, there was still pushback. One night she met Russ again, this time at a VFW hall in Pelham, where they were invited to speak on a panel about election security. The room was packed. Veterans, retirees, young parents, some skeptical, others clearly supportive. An older man in the back stood during the Q&A. "I voted for 50 years, he said. "I've never missed one. I don't care if someone's a Democrat or Republican. I just want to know, how do we stop this from happening again?" Karoline took a breath. "By making noise," she said, "by refusing to let things stay buried. When you see something, speak. When people try to silence you, get louder. Systems don't fix themselves. People fix them. People like you." The room clapped, not wildly, not performatively. It was the kind of slow, steady applause that came from agreement, not excitement. But not everyone in that room clapped. Back in Concord, Keener's legal team was on the move. They filed a request to dismiss the ethics investigation, citing unfair public prejudice and politically motivated defamation. It was a desperate play, and it didn't work. The committee denied the request and moved to the next phase, formal review. That meant testimony, witnesses, documents. Dana, the former courthouse worker who had risked everything to meet Karoline, agreed to testify, privately but officially. So did two others who had come forward after the press conference. The net was tightening, then came the call. A staffer from the House Oversight Subcommittee reached out. They were assembling a panel to review judicial bias at the state level. They wanted Karoline to testify. She stared at the phone in disbelief. "You're asking me to go to Washington?" "Yes," the voice said. "You've lit a fire. Now we want to hear how you did it." But Karoline knew that the real fight wasn't in courtrooms or headlines. It was in the hearts of ordinary people who were finally starting to ask hard questions. The Capitol felt colder than she expected. Karoline walked down the corridor outside the hearing room in a dark navy blazer and low heels, her notes folded neatly in her hand. No press around her, no entourage, just her and the sound of polished shoes against tile. Inside, the room was already half full. Congressional aides shuffled through folders. A few representatives sat quietly behind the long, elevated bench, reviewing their briefing packets. The chair of the subcommittee, Congressman Roland Mays from Texas, looked up and gave a slight nod as Karoline took her seat at the witness table. No cameras, just audio recordings. The public transcript would be released later. The goal wasn't drama, it was clarity. Karoline adjusted the microphone and waited for the prompt. "Miss Leavitt," Mays said, "please begin with your statement." She opened with one line, "I didn't come here to talk about a man. I came to talk about a system." It wasn't rehearsed, it was just real. She laid out the timeline, the dinner, the connections, the quiet donor circles, the cases that quietly vanished before ever reaching scrutiny. She didn't shout, she didn't posture. She told the story like it was, because it was. Then she paused. "I know people who think this is just politics, that we're playing team sports. But if we can't trust our judges, we can't trust anything. Not elections, not laws, not fairness. And that trust doesn't get destroyed all at once. It erodes piece by piece every time someone powerful gets away with something because no one asked the right questions." A representative from Oregon leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that Judge Keener accepted bribes?" "No," Karoline said. "I'm saying that favors don't always come in envelopes. Sometimes they look like dinners, or jobs for family members, or a quiet call before a ruling. And if we keep pretending that's not influence, then we've already lost." Her voice didn't waver once. The hearing lasted 2 hours. There were questions, some friendly, some probing, but Karoline stayed grounded. When it was over, she gathered her papers and quietly walked out. No applause, no flashbulbs, just a long hallway and a woman who had told the truth, even when it cost her. 2 days later, the Judicial Conduct Committee released its findings. Judge Keener had violated multiple standards of conduct. A pattern of inappropriate relationships with political donors and consultants with active interests in court proceedings. He was given the option to resign. He took it. The media ran with it. Some praised Karoline, others mocked her, accused her of being power-hungry. But the facts stood on their own. In Concord, the headlines faded within a week. People moved on. But something had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. Karoline didn't return to the courtroom. She didn't need to. Instead, she went back to Rye, back to her kitchen table, where it had all started. She opened her laptop, started drafting new legislation, one that would require all judges in the state to disclose meetings with lobbyists and political consultants, no exceptions. She called it the Transparent Bench Act. At a town hall in Dover a few weeks later, she stood in front of a crowd and said, "You don't change the world all at once. You change it one truth at a time." An older woman stood up and asked, "Do you think it made a difference?" Karoline smiled. "I know it did, because next time someone tries to make a decision in the dark, they'll think twice." What began with a dismissal ended with accountability, not just for one judge, but for every citizen who forgot their voice mattered. If you believe in truth, if you believe in fairness, real fairness, then speak up. Because staying silent doesn't keep the peace, it keeps the problem.